Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, taking a look at Week 10's betting lines. And the best way to do that is to bring in Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info. You can join him right there at prosportsinfo.com. Steve joins us each and every week here at Mark Rogers TV to break down the lines for college football. And Steve, we've got a big one starting up on a Friday night. It doesn't, on the surface, in terms of name brand, look like a big game, but in terms of ACC Coastal Division play, it is huge with Pitt going to Virginia. The Cavaliers, of course, not only won last week against North Carolina, but covered, and they've done pretty well at doing just that. A Pitt with only one loss, so you got to ignore the overall one-loss record with four losses against a brutal non-conference slate of Notre Dame, South Florida, or Central Florida, and Penn State. Just the one loss in the ACC. So this is for the division lead here, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, Virginia obviously playing better than expected this year. They cracked the top 25 this week for the first time in quite a while. One of my favorite angles, Mark, in college football is to play against teams that crack the top 25 for the first time in several years. We saw both Boston College and even Kentucky somewhat falter in that spot this year, at least against the point spread. And I definitely think this price is a premium now. Laying 7 points against a Pitt team, as you mentioned, has played a very difficult schedule this season. In fact, their schedule has been about 7 points tougher than Virginia's on average. Overall, they faced opponents that average over 6 yards per play offensively, which is better than what Virginia does. And Pitt's offense has been very strong. I think these two teams are very evenly matched. I think the spread should probably, just be around a field goal or so. So I do think we're starting to see inflation on Virginia, and the top 25 cracking that for the first time also could be a distraction.
We got Steve Merrill on the line from Pro Sports Info, breaking down Week 10 betting lines in college football. We've got a huge one in the SEC Eastern Division for the second consecutive week. It involves the favorite. Georgia stood up to its first test in division against Florida, winning that one, going away in the fourth quarter to cover the points. They take on Kentucky. This is a road game for Georgia. And I believe we've got more disrespect for the Wildcats, who continue to be an underdog. Last week against an 0-3 SEC team, they were a full touchdown underdog, obviously won the game at the wire. We've got Kentucky back at the well against Vegas and against the Georgia Bulldogs.
Yeah, I thought that line was too high last week, full 7 points against Missouri. As you mentioned, Kentucky has been flying under the radar this year from the general betting public, yet they're still just 4-4 against the spread. Despite being 7-1 straight up, they're just 4-4 against the number. So I do think the point spreads have started to catch up. In fact, that was their first cover in the previous 3 games. And my power ratings actually favored Georgia by 11 in this one. So the current line of 9.5 actually is not high enough. The concern, of course, I have is the scheduling situation. They're coming off the big win against Florida. Keep in mind, they came off the bye week after that bad loss at LSU. They were very focused for Florida, and they have Auburn on deck next week at home. This game is sandwiched in between as a road game. So I think it's a bad scheduling spot for Georgia, even though the point spread is a bit low.
The Big Ten Western Division was a huge point of college football in terms of conference alignment and standings last week, with all the big teams in play against each other or against quality opponents. So Northwestern took control of the division. Wisconsin, Iowa, Purdue all lost. Purdue, after the big stretch drive of 4 straight wins and looking really good, we could kind of see the letdown coming, lost at Michigan State. Iowa took a lead against Penn State and then faltered down the stretch, losing in Happy Valley. So a key matchup in the Big Ten Western Division with Iowa going to Purdue, Purdue back to being about a 2.5-point pick at this point.
Yeah, I think the line is actually, I think we have the wrong team favored here. My power ratings actually favor Iowa by 1, and I am a bit concerned about the scheduling spot for Purdue, as you mentioned. This is a time change, by the way. So now starts, I believe, at 3:30 Eastern. I believe it was initially scheduled for an earlier start. It actually goes later now. 3:30 Eastern was going to be a noon start. So this is a high-profile TV game now. I just worry about the scheduling spot for Purdue after losing against Michigan State as a road favorite. It looks like this point spread is still overinflated here. You've got an Iowa team that's flying a bit under the radar. They've gone 3-1 straight up and against the spread the last 4, despite that loss at Penn State last week. I just think they're more likely to be focused here. And I really like this rush defense. They're getting up just 2.8 yards per carry, and that's important against a Purdue team that's averaging over 5 yards a rush this season.
Subscribe to Mark Rogers TV for the best discussion, debate, and analysis in college football. And also join Steve Merrill at prosportsinfo.com for his take on not just college football, but the NFL, the NBA, and baseball just concluded. All right, so we've got Ohio State back on the field for the first time since that debacle at West Lafayette. They're still a strong 18 to 19 point favorite against a Nebraska team that's run 2 wins back-to-back now, with the makeup game against Bethune-Cookman taking place to replace the Akron game that was wiped away. Your thoughts about the Huskers and the Buckeyes?
Yeah, it's still hard to trust Nebraska. I mentioned several times this season, a team like Nebraska with the new coaching staff, talent, yet they haven't shown it yet on the field. You have to be very careful with. I mentioned that about Florida State, UCLA as well. Those teams, we started to see something from them, but then Florida State, of course, laid an egg again this past week, even though they did look good at times in that game, just outclassed by Clemson down the stretch. Nebraska, though, is a team that's finally done something. They've gotten a win back-to-back weeks. But that Bethune-Cookman win wasn't that impressive. They were a 47-point favorite in that game. They didn't even score the point spread offensively. They did put up 53 against Minnesota the week before, though, so that could be the sign that things are starting to click offensively. They've put up about 100 points now their last 2 games. Ohio State's problem, as I said a couple of weeks ago, Mark, has been the defense this year. On this season, they're giving up 5.9 yards per play against teams that average just 5.6. Statistically, this is a below-average defensive team from a yards per play perspective. And I think Nebraska can actually take advantage of that. I like the over in this game. I think both teams will get some points, 72.5, but for a good reason. Should be a shootout.
Yeah, it's hard to believe the Buckeyes struggling that much, but they still stand at 7-1, and we will see where they place in the college football rankings released on Tuesday night. Virginia Tech, known for having one of those major home field advantages in college football, like an LSU or a Clemson. I don't know that it's necessarily backed up by the numbers, but certainly debunked this year against an average Georgia Tech team, in particular last week, in which they were throttled on defense. They're playing a Boston College team that at least technically, can still win the ACC championship. They have yet to play Clemson. They've only lost 1 game in the ACC. They're a very slight 2-point favorite in Blacksburg.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of an overreaction based on recent results. My power ratings make this game a pick 'em. So I still am not big on Virginia Tech this year. Defensively, they're not good. They're getting up 6 yards per play against teams that average just 5.6. Boston College is an average offensive team at best, but they're a very good defensive team. So Boston College does hold a substantial defensive edge in this game, but I actually think Virginia Tech holds a bit of an offensive edge plus home field. And then on top of that, this line is just inflated now. My power rating is making a pick 'em. Current line is Boston College minus 2.5. Obviously, not a lot of value there. If it does hit that key number of 3 or more by the weekend, at plus 3 or more, I think you could start saying you're getting some value with Virginia Tech at home.
2 huge games in the Big 12. We start off with Oklahoma taking on Texas Tech. Of course, Oklahoma with only 1 loss overall. Texas Tech has defeated some really good teams this year, and Oklahoma, based on offensive explosion and reputation, I'm sure, a big 13-point favorite on the road.
Yeah, my power ratings only make the line 11, so I do think it's a bit inflated here. Total is huge, 77.5. Maybe the biggest college football total we'll see this regular season. And for good reason. Obviously, Oklahoma's explosive offensively. They're averaging 43 points a game, 528 yards a game. But Texas Tech. But Oklahoma's averaging almost 9 yards per play, which is just insane, 49 points a game. 9 yards per play against teams that average allowing just 5.7. That's how good this Oklahoma offense is. And at 77.5, that total still might not be high enough.
Steve Merrill joins us from Pro Sports Info. You got to make a trip over there to see what he has to offer. ProSportsInfo.com. Steve, an even bigger game in the Big 12 involving 2 of the chief participants in contention with the West Virginia-Texas angle, along with Oklahoma. West Virginia at Texas, of course, the Longhorns coming off the big loss in Stillwater.
Yeah, my power ratings make Texas about a 2-point favorite. That's pretty much in line with this one. As I mentioned on this show last week, I really liked Oklahoma State. My line made that game a pick 'em. Texas at 3.5 was inflated. And then on top of that, both teams had the bye. I thought the bye week might hurt a Texas team that had won 6 straight entering. Oklahoma State, meanwhile, had lost 3 of the previous 4. So that was a perfect example of the bye week coming at a good time for the Cowboys, a bad time for the Longhorns. I did use a best bet for my clients on Oklahoma State last week, so I'm not going to read too much into that loss by Texas. I think a bigger question is, can the Longhorns rebound now? That loss at Maryland in week 1 or against Maryland in week 1 is really going to come back to bite them at this point. But that, of course, was a non-conference loss. As you said, with 1 loss here, they could still finish top 2 in the conference and have a shot at the title game, just like West Virginia. But the team that loses this game will probably be on the outside looking in when it comes to the Big 12 championship game. Right now, you look at the matchup here. Texas has a substantial defensive edge, but West Virginia has a huge offensive edge. In general, though, I usually like to take the better defensive team in these type of games.
So many big games this week. Northwestern has taken the lead in the Big Ten Western Division. They control their own destiny. They could lose this week to Notre Dame. Obviously, that doesn't affect their place in the conference, which is somewhat amusing in regards to going maybe 8-4, 7-5, and reaching a Big Ten championship game. So this one, the focus more on Notre Dame and their pursuit of a national college football playoff appearance. Notre Dame going actually to Northwestern. In the past, they've played at Soldier Field, but they're at Ryan Field at Northwestern as about a 9.5 point favorite.
Yeah, my power rating is only favored Notre Dame by 5.5 in this game, so the line is inflated. The problem, once again, with Northwestern is they just can't run the ball. This team is averaging only 2.6 yards per carry. They're not great passing it either. This is a really bad offense. In fact, on the season, they're averaging 4.6 yards per play against opponents that allow 5.3. So they're going to have a very tough time moving the ball against a really good Notre Dame defense that's giving up just 4.5 yards per play. To put that in perspective, Northwestern is averaging half as much as Oklahoma on a yards per play basis, yet they're in the front runner, as you said, for the division. I think it's phony. Unfortunately, this line is higher than I would have liked, but I think Notre Dame matches up pretty well.
Steve Merrill joining us from Pro Sports Info. Got to join him there for his take on all the major sports. Join him at prosportsinfo.com. 3 big ones left. It is a loaded Saturday. Stanford at Washington. It's a mess in the Pac-12 North Division. Washington State controls it, but they still have to play Washington. Stanford has fallen off, but this is still a huge game that Washington needs to win as a 9 or 10 point favorite.
Yeah, I think the line is pretty much where it should be based on my power ratings. Last week, I liked Stanford against Washington State. More so, I thought it was a bad spot for Washington State, a bit of a letdown. They did start off slow, but they pulled ahead in the second half and ended up getting that win still on the road. Stanford has now lost 3 of their last 4 games, both straight up and against the spread. But Washington's lost 2 of their last 3, and more importantly, they've lost 4 straight against the number. My power ratings actually have this one spot on right now, so not sure there's much value either way.
Penn State and Michigan, I was hoping this line was going to be in the 4 to 5 to 6 range, favoring Michigan, but the Wolverines about a 10.5 point favorite at home against Penn State.
Yeah, I think, Michigan is a team that's very good defensively. At times, they've looked really good offensively as well. My power ratings actually favor them by 11 in this game, so I think the line is pretty much where it should be. What jumps out to me, though, is the fact that Michigan's defense is allowing just 3.7 yards per play, just 14 points a game. This will be their biggest test, so against a Penn State offense, it's averaging 41 points a game. And, of course, it's also a huge revenge spot for Michigan after that 42-13 loss last year. Looks like a pretty good setup here. You're at home with revenge and a great defense. The line actually is where it should be, so there might be some value still with Michigan.
Kind of hard to relate to one of the bigger point spreads being considered by the nation to be the biggest game that's going to have the most eyeballs and the most attention, and it's on CBS late night or prime time, I should say, with, of course, LSU hosting Alabama, and Alabama with their sheer game control and dominance as a 14 point favorite.
Yeah, my power rating is favoring by 13.5. So once again, I think this line is actually pretty accurate, even though it might look big on the surface. A lot of people a few weeks ago, all the shows I did, they couldn't understand how LSU was getting almost a touchdown at home against Georgia. That turned out to be correct. LSU won that game by 20. I thought Mississippi State would hang with them better. I thought it was a really bad spot for LSU that following week. I was impressed with the fact that the Tigers won easily 19-3. And they obviously get the bye week at a good time here, coming in off a bye to get ready for the biggest game of the season. And they have a solid revenge mode of 24-10 loss. Home dogs in this price range with the week off and revenge are a long-term 60% play. So the situational setup does favor LSU. Unfortunately, the line is pretty much where it should be. I make it 13.5. So if you can get 14 or more, there is maybe some value at that point with LSU getting more than 2 touchdowns.
Steve Merrill, Pro Sports Info. Get over there. You can hear the information and the insight, and he's got a whole lot more in store for you at prosportsinfo.com. Of course, if you love college football, right here, the place to be at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. We'll see you next time.